So, at the beginning of this story, we see a young man named Antonio. We learn that he was a very famous kickboxer. However, due to some criminal activities, he spent the last 4 years in prison. But now, after being released from jail, he has moved to a small town in Japan. Antonio actually started doing odd jobs to make a living. For example, sometimes he would do deliveries, and other times he would work as a cleaner. His financial situation was so bad that he didn't even have enough money to buy a cell phone. Then, Antonio finally got a job at an underground parking garage where an old man used to work. But when that old man quit his job, Antonio got the position. Antonio didn't really have much to do there. His only job was to monitor the cars coming and going. However, on his very first day, a girl approaches him. This girl starts talking to him as if she's known him for a long time. Antonio was completely stunned after seeing this. But the girl takes out some food from her bag and gives it to Antonio, then starts talking to him nicely. We then learn that this girl was blind. That's why she couldn't see. And she had a good relationship with the old man who used to work here before. That's why she would sometimes come here and chat with him. But the girl doesn't realize that the old man has quit his job and that Antonio is now sitting in front of her. That's why she kept talking nonstop. However, she soon realizes that the old man isn't in front of her. Some young man is sitting there. And after being silent for so long, Antonio finally tells the girl that the old man has actually quit his job and he got it. Now, after hearing this, the girl is initially scared, but then she thanks Antonio for accepting the food. However, Antonio returns her food. But the girl tells him that when the old man worked here, she would sometimes come and watch TV shows with him while chatting. And that's how she got to know the old man. Now, since the old man isn't here, the girl tries to leave and head home. But then it starts raining. So she gets stuck there. Since it was raining outside, Antonio tells her to come inside. But when the girl comes inside and starts watching a TV show, Antonio is completely amazed by her sense of hearing. Now, after the TV show ends, when the girl tries to leave, before going, she gives the food to Antonio and tells him to remember to water the plant outside. After that, Antonio goes to take a shower. And when he comes back to the room, we learn that this room was previously used by the old man. That's why the room's condition was pretty bad. So Antonio first cleans the room thoroughly, and then starts eating the food the girl gave him. The next morning, we see the girl waking up, cooking, and starting to eat. We learn that this girl lives alone in the entire house. And even though she's blind, she manages all these tasks by herself. She even works at a call center. Although sometimes customers would call and annoy her with various things, a smile never left her face. But her boss was the biggest jerk. He would often try to touch her in various ways. But since the girl was afraid of losing her job, she never complained to anyone. Meanwhile, Antonio goes to his old boxing club, where he used to practice boxing. However, he had been banned from the club due to criminal activities. But now that he has come to the club to apologize, his coach immediately warns him not to come to the club. Then he is brought before the club owner. Although Antonio apologizes to him, the club owner didn't want to allow him back into the club. But since he understood his mistake, the coach forgives him and tells him to get into the boxing ring. But Antonio didn't want to go at all. He was a little scared. But then the club owner comes from behind with boxing gloves and tells him, "I want to see you in the ring too." But Antonio returns the gloves to him and says, "I just came to apologize. I don't want to return to the boxing world. That's why I don't even want to touch boxing gloves." Saying this, he leaves. So after leaving from there, Antonio goes to a public telephone booth and calls a woman. This woman was actually the wife of the man he had killed some time ago, and he has called her now to apologize. However, the woman clearly tells him, "I've already forgiven you, so there's no need to keep calling and bothering me." Later, when Antonio was working in the parking lot in the evening, he sees the girl walking by. So Antonio becomes a little curious. He hoped the girl would come here. And then finally, the girl also comes to the cabin. So Antonio first thanks her for yesterday's box because her food was very delicious. And then the girl smells the flowers of the nearby plant, which makes her realize that the plant has been watered. Then, when they both go into the cabin and start watching a show, the girl smells something. So she asks him to open the window. The girl actually thought that Antonio might have just exercised, which is why the smell was there. But a little later, Antonio realizes that the smell was actually coming from his shoes. So he becomes even more uncomfortable, but he couldn't say anything. so he hides his shoes. Then, as they were watching the TV show, the girl asks about the heroine of the TV show. She asks, "Is this heroine very beautiful?" Then Antonio says, "Yes, she's very beautiful. And she's wearing earrings just like you." Although Antonio was lying, the girl becomes very happy after hearing this. Then Antonio buys the girl some food. And then they introduce themselves for the first time. The girl's name was Carrie. And before leaving, the girl tells Antonio, "I'll come again next week." So Antonio decides to wait a week for her. Then, when Carrie returns home and was eating, she suddenly notices that her bathroom pipe has leaked and water has collected on her bathroom floor. Actually, a piece of cloth got stuck in the pipe, which caused this problem. And after going into the bathroom, she slips and gets a lot of pain in her leg. Then, the next week, when Antonio was working, he starts praying for the girl to come. And finally, the girl arrives. But as soon as she arrives, the girl notices Antonio's new shoes. And then they both start watching a TV show. However, in the TV show, the heroine was proposing to the hero. And after seeing this, Carrie asks Antonio about the hero. She asks, "Is the hero handsome?" Then Antonio says, "Yes, the hero is handsome, but the hero is a playboy." However, after hearing this, Carrie asks him, "Tell me honestly, are you handsome?" Then Antonio is completely stunned because this is a question that perhaps no man can answer. Because Antonio himself didn't know if he was handsome or average. So he remains silent. And Carrie also understands why he is silent, because he isn't handsome. So she tells him, "It's okay. A person's heart should be good, more than their looks." Saying this, as she was leaving, Antonio realizes that he is slowly falling in love with this girl. However, when Carrie was trying to cross the street, she gets into a minor accident with a private car, which causes her to fall and get injured. She gets a lot of pain in her leg. So Antonio goes to drop Carrie off at her house. And when Carrie asks his name on the bus, Antonio doesn't tell her his name. Because he thought, what if the girl thinks something else after hearing an English name? But then the girl says, "Okay, I understand. You don't want to say your name. I'll call you old man or uncle because I think you're a bit older." Then, after getting off the bus, when the girl couldn't walk anymore, Antonio tries to carry her on his shoulders. Although the girl warns him, "My apartment is really high up. You have to climb stairs." But since Antonio was in love, these things meant nothing to him. He starts carrying the girl up the stairs. Then, when he drops Carrie off in her room, Carrie asks him for another favor. She says, "My bathroom is flooded. Maybe there's something wrong with the pipe. Can you help me a little?" So when Antonio goes to check her bathroom, he finds a piece of cloth in the pipe. So when he removes the cloth, he realizes it was actually the girl's underwear. This creates an awkward silence between them. Now, since Antonio helped Carrie, as a thank you, Carrie gives him a concert ticket. And she says, "Go enjoy it with your friends." However, Antonio stood silently with the ticket. He didn't say anything. So Carrie also realizes that he actually has no friends. He's just as alone as she is. So finally, Carrie tells him, "Then let's go to the concert together." Then, on the day of the concert, Carrie gets herself completely ready. However, like other girls, Carrie also had a lot of trouble choosing an outfit. But at the very last minute, she changes her outfit. Then, after enjoying the concert thoroughly, they both go to a restaurant for dinner. Here, Carrie tells Antonio, "When my parents were alive, I used to come here with them often." Then, when they start eating, food spills on Carrie. Then she starts talking about her life. She tells him, "In college, I was an artist. I was a sculptor, someone who made statues." Then she asks about Antonio's life. However, Antonio doesn't give her any answer. He only says, "I'm a delivery boy." But since Carrie thought of him as an old man or an uncle, she asks him about marriage and children. However, Antonio doesn't answer this. So Carrie also feels that maybe she told a stupid joke. So she apologizes to him. Then Antonio asks Carrie, "Why are you so interested in my past?" Then Carrie tells him, "I just wanted to know a little more about you. That's all, no other interest." However, Antonio treats her very rudely. So Carrie gets up from there and goes home. But before leaving, Antonio finally decides to tell her everything about himself. He tells her, "Actually, my name is Antonio, and I'm 24. I'm professionally a kickboxer. But due to some criminal activities, I spent the last 4 years in jail. That's why I don't have many friends. I also can't talk very well. I'm an introverted person. But then Carrie apologizes for bothering him and goes straight into her room. Then, the next day at the office, Carrie's boss calls Carrie into his cabin and gives her a gift. However, Carrie directly refuses him. She says, "You already gave me a concert ticket. I don't want any more gifts." But the boss repeatedly tries to force the gift on her. He tells her, there's an expensive necklace in the box. He actually wanted to tempt Carrie and take her on a date by any means, so he could take advantage of Carrie's blindness. However, when he was trying to force her to take the gift, another girl comes into the cabin, and she tells Carrie, "A customer wants to talk to you urgently." So Carrie quickly leaves from there. Meanwhile, Antonio comes to meet his old coach and the club owner. They were both requesting Antonio to return to the world of kickboxing because his coach was impressed by his fighting skills and the underground fights he had participated in. They felt that if Antonio returned to this world, he could achieve something great. That's why they were repeatedly requesting him. However, Antonio clearly tells them, "For years ago, I was a gangster. I used to work for an organization, and the person who ran that organization was named Sakumo. Sakumo was actually a big-time gangster. He could do anything to collect his dues, meaning he understood nothing but money. That's why Antonio, on behalf of his boss Sakumo, would beat up various clients and try to collect money from them. One day, while doing this, he killed a man, which led to the police arresting him, and he had to spend the last 4 years in jail. And when his coach and the club owner hear this story, they are also completely stunned. Then Antonio goes to an orphanage. We learn that Antonio grew up here from childhood. A nun raised him. And when he meets the nun here, the nun is very happy to see him. However, the nun asks him, "Have you stopped working for bad people?" Then Antonio shows her his hand. He had actually removed the gangster tattoo from his hand, meaning he has now become good. So the nun becomes very happy, and she gives him a hair bow made by the children, and tells him, "Give it as a gift to someone you like. I hope it won't be a boy." We then learn that Antonio and Sakumo both grew up in this orphanage. Sakumo always told him, "Good people are always weak. That's why being bad is the best option." Meanwhile, when Carrie returns home at night, her boss was already waiting for her in front of her house. Then he forces his way into the house and starts checking around. Carrie actually hadn't opened the gift he gave her yet. So he opens the gift and forcibly starts putting the necklace on her and starts treating her badly. During this struggle, when Carrie falls to the floor, she tries to activate the emergency alarm, but her boss grabs her and beats her severely, trying to force himself on her. But then, fortunately, Antonio arrives. And as soon as he sees her boss in this state, he grabs him and beats him severely. He breaks one of his fingers and warns him to stay far away from that girl. So the boss agrees and quickly flees from there. Although Carrie repeatedly told him to let her boss go during the fight, Antonio didn't listen to anything she said. And after the boss leaves, Carrie tells Antonio, "Why did you hit the boss? Now I'm going to lose my job." But Antonio tells her, "You don't need to work in a place like that." But Carrie tells him, "You wouldn't understand how difficult it is for a blind person to find a job." And after hearing this, Antonio becomes very emotional. So he decides to cover all of Carrie's expenses. Then, when Antonio returns to work, Carrie was constantly on his mind, because he was thinking about how bad Carrie's situation was. A few days later, Carrie finally arrives here, and she tells him that she has quit that job. Then they both go out for a walk. They enjoy themselves a lot by the sea near the windmill. And here Antonio tells her, when he was a child, he used to come here with his mother, but his mother died in an accident. But he somehow survived. Then Carrie asks Antonio to get her a sea glass. So Antonio finds a very beautiful sea glass. After seeing this, Carrie becomes very happy, because she felt that there was someone in the world who still cared about her. Then Antonio rejoins his club, and here he starts working hard. Then he brings a puppy as a gift for Carrie, and they both move into the same room. One day Antonio opens and cleans the room's window so that good light can come into the house. But then Carrie calls him and makes him sit beside her. Then she holds his face and tries to understand what his facial structure is like. Although Carrie was telling Antonio to look into her eyes, Antonio couldn't do it at all. Then finally, they both become very emotional and kiss each other. Meanwhile, as Antonio was preparing for the boxing championship, Carrie, on the other hand, had started her old sculpting work. She had made some mugs and cups. We see that the three of them, including the puppy, were living very well here. They were enjoying themselves a lot. And when Antonio would come home after boxing, Carrie would give him a very good massage in the evening. One day, when Carrie notices the mark on his hand, she asks him about it. But Antonio lies to her and says, "Actually, it's a burn mark." However, Carrie then tells him, "I don't just want to stay here as a massage girl." But then Antonio says, "Very soon, I'll open a shop for you." Then, when the first match of the championship begins, Antonio easily wins this match. However, he didn't know that his childhood friend and his biggest enemy, Tsukumo, was waiting for him. As soon as Tsukumo meets him, he starts insulting his coach. However, Antonio tells his coach to stay calm because he didn't want any arguments. Then the next day, Carrie takes Antonio to her parents' graveyard. And here she tells him, "Actually, for years ago, when I got my driving license, I went out driving with my parents. But then I saw a burning person fall from a building. That's why my attention was diverted. And then I had an accident. And since then, I haven't been able to see. And my parents also died in that accident." However, after hearing this, Antonio is completely stunned. And when he sees the date on the grave, he realizes this is the date when, at his friend Tsukumo's bidding, he had burned a client alive. Now, after hearing all this, Antonio starts blaming himself entirely. He thought that because of him, Carrie lost her eyesight and she also lost her parents. So he is completely broken inside. He didn't know what to do, because he was never prepared for such a difficult truth. Anyway, a few days later, when Carrie was cooking, she suddenly starts feeling a lot of pain in her eyes. But then, on the other hand, Antonio comes and meets Tsukumo. And Tsukumo starts offering him underground fighting. Although he could get a lot of money if he won that match, he directly refuses him and gets out of the car. Then, when he returns home, he couldn't find Carrie anywhere. So he rushes to the hospital. Here he learns that Carrie is completely fine. She had fainted due to rib pain. And then the doctor tells him, actually, her retinal detachment is progressing, so she needs surgery as soon as possible. If the operation cannot be performed, then the little vision she has left will also disappear. Meaning, if Carrie's eye surgery is performed now, her eyesight might return. Although Carrie already knew this, she hadn't shared it with Antonio. Then, when Antonio goes to meet the nun tells him, "The children are making music boxes. Tell me your favorite song. I'll arrange for a box to be made for you." However, since Antonio was blaming himself for his dark past and everything, he couldn't forgive himself at all. But then the nun tells him, "You are a very good person. Forgive yourself and move forward, because you can never change what happened in the past. But you can definitely change the present if you want." Then Antonio comes and asks Carrie, "Why did you never tell me about the surgery?" But Carrie tells him, "Actually, what's the use of those eyes? Even with eyes, I couldn't save my parents. I couldn't save my parents even when I had eyes. I was blind even with eyes. So, these eyes won't be of any use to me." However, after hearing this, Antonio starts explaining to her, "Still, how will you be able to live without seeing your future husband and children?" And by explaining this way, he finally convinces Carrie to have the operation. However, since her operation will cost a large sum of money, the responsibility of arranging all the money has now fallen on Antonio's shoulders. Then, when they both return home, Antonio is completely stunned after seeing the logo of the illegal organization on Carrie's room door. So he quickly goes to meet Tsukumo. And he tells him, "I've broken up with Carrie, so don't try to harm her." However, this whole thing was actually a lie. He only said that to save Carrie. But we see Tsukumo giving him some money and saying, "Let's have one last match." We see Antonio bringing all this money and giving it to the coach, and tells him to stay at the hospital with Carrie until her operation is done. And he will quickly bring the rest of the money and deposit it at the hospital after the match. Although the coach didn't want him to get involved in illegal activities at all, since it was now a matter of life and death, the coach agrees to help him. And so that no one can find out Antonio's identity even if he gets caught, he returns home and burns all his documents. Then finally, the day of the underground fight arrives. There was a rule in this fight. The opponent had to be beaten until he was unconscious. Then, when the fight begins, although Antonio initially takes the lead, the opponent soon starts attacking him. and beats him almost to death. But Antonio, like other heroes, finally makes a comeback. And after beating his opponent fighter severely, he finally wins the fight. Although Tsukumo couldn't believe that Antonio had won the fight. However, since Antonio had no other option, he finally won the fight by giving his best. And the coach was also standing among the audience, supporting Antonio. Then, when the coach brings this money and deposits it at the hospital, Carrie's operation is completed. Carrie could now see everything clearly. And the coach finally calls Antonio and informs him that the prize money received was used for Carrie's operation, and the rest was given to the woman whose husband he had killed a few years ago. Now, when Antonio learns that Carrie has regained her eyesight, he feels a lot of relief, and he comes out of much of his remorse. However, when he was trying to walk down the street, a car suddenly hits him in an accident. And a man gets out, stabs him in the back, and leaves. These were actually Tsukumo's thugs. Since Antonio had betrayed the organization, Tsukumo had done this. Then, for the next few days, Carrie starts waiting for Antonio. But Antonio didn't come. So Carrie was very upset. And now she will be forced to leave her house because the building's renovation work will begin. And just then, Carrie receives a package. The package was actually addressed to Antonio. It contained a music box, playing Carrie's favorite song. And since the name of the church was written on the back of the music box, Carrie goes to the church to find out about Antonio. And here the nun tells her, actually, Antonio started blaming himself for everything. And then she tells her about that accident. She tells her that the burning person whose sight distracted you and caused your accident, Antonio had burned that person to death. That's why he felt that he was solely responsible for you losing your eyesight and your parents' death. And after hearing this, Carrie is completely stunned. Although she had forgiven him for that incident, she still couldn't find Antonio anywhere. Then Carrie returns to her house, and she tries to sculpt Antonio's face with clay, but she couldn't do anything at all. Then we're shown a scene 2 years later. We see that Carrie has now opened a shop where she sells the things she makes. Their dog has now grown very big. Actually, since Carrie was very good at giving massages, she would also go to various rehab centers and give massages for free. One day, when she comes to massage a young man, we see that this young man is none other than Antonio. Although the girl doesn't recognize him, Antonio clearly recognizes her after seeing her. But he lays silently, so the girl doesn't understand much. And when she tries to give him a massage, the girl starts feeling something strange. She felt like she had known this body before. But when she sees another name by the bed, she quietly leaves from there. Then, when Antonio recovers a bit, he walks to the front of that shop. He is completely stunned after seeing the shop with his name on it. And coming inside, he sees that all their things were in the shop. Meaning, after seeing the olive plant, the music box, he starts crying remembering the time he spent with Carrie. However, he buys an olive plant from the shop and leaves from there. But suddenly on the street, their dog runs to him and knocks him to the ground. And when Carrie runs here, she says, "You're that guy from the hospital, right? Let me drop you home." But Antonio doesn't say anything to her and quickly tries to leave from there. Then, when Carrie returns to her shop, her salesgirl tells her, "A very strange customer just came." He started crying after seeing this music box. And after hearing this, Carrie clearly understands that the person she just met is none other than Antonio. So she runs to try and find Antonio. However, she couldn't find Antonio anywhere. Antonio had already left from there. And at the very end, we see Antonio standing by the sea, crying. And he had that sea glass in his hand. And very soon, Carrie also arrives here. And finally, after seeing each other, they become very emotional. And at such an interesting point, this entire movie ends here.